We wanted to start off by asking you about your thoughts on USAID. You have a tweet that's very helpful. You say, no, the Trump admin isn't dismantling USAID. USAID is now directly under U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who spent years as part of the USAID NED regime change complex, advancing U.S. aggression and political capture abroad. Before Rubio became Secretary of State, he was on the NED USAID subsidiary IRI's board of directors, doing the very things people mistakenly believe he and the Trump administration will stop. So, can you elaborate on this, both on the way that people are misunderstanding the news and what the news actually is?
Yes, well, I can't blame people for misunderstanding what is going on, because both sides of the American political aisle, they're deliberately lying to the public. So on the so-called left side, they're lying about what USAID does. There's posing as if it is some sort of humanitarian organization helping people all around the globe. And if you listen to the actual Trump administration, what they're saying, the things that they are citing that need to be brought to an end, they're talking about DEI, they're talking about transgender art performances. They have not mentioned foreign interference, regime change, subversion, stifling development, despite the word development being in the organization's name. They haven't mentioned any of that, and they have not said that they are going to stop any of that. And if people look at the State Department's official website and the statement about USAID, they even say that they just want to make sure that it is helping advance American interests abroad. They didn't say that they're done interfering abroad. They just want to make sure everything is being channeled into American, I would say, interference abroad. I'm almost certain it's going to continue, if not under USAID, under some other organization that assumes its responsibilities.
And can you give some examples of what USAID actually does?
Yeah, so there's a few areas of responsibility, I guess you could say, they handle. A lot of people are talking about regime change, and that is absolutely one of their activities that they're involved in. So there are opposition groups that the U.S. builds up in targeted nations. They're not just building up political opposition, they are building a whole parallel system next to the indigenous institutions of a targeted nation. And the goal is to reach a critical mass where a color revolution can then remove the existing government and replace it with this parallel organization that they have created. So USAID is spending money side by side with the National Endowment for Democracy, all of its subsidiaries, all of the adjacent private foundations that work hand in hand with all of these US government organizations. So that is one thing that they do. Another thing that they do is participate in counterinsurgency. And before we began, I showed you a US government counterinsurgency manual. And they have a whole section about USAID and how it is used as a tool in counterinsurgency. What is counterinsurgency? What are they talking about? They're talking about when the US military goes into a nation like Iraq or Afghanistan, they remove a government from power and they install a client regime in its place. The people there rising up against it. And here's a photo. So just think about how tone deaf or brazen they are to post this picture. This is a picture of the Philippines. The U.S. conquered the Philippines. They stripped it from Spain after the Spanish-American War. There was an uprising because they wanted to be an independent nation. The U.S. military brutally suppressed it. Mass murder, concentration camps. This is all listed on the State Department's website, by the way. And so they're talking about insurgency, counterinsurgency, and USAID's role in the counterinsurgency process. So that is the second area of responsibility USAID participates in. And the third is stifling development. So I've covered this a lot here in Southeast Asia. One of the US government's obsessions here is the Mekong River. The Mekong River is on the other side of the planet from the United States. It has nothing to do with the US, has nothing to do with Japan or Australia, who often work with the US to involve themselves in the Mekong. And what they're doing is telling nations along the Mekong River, you're not building dams, you're not developing industry along it. We're going to maintain these impoverished villages where they are fishing fish in the river to extinction, and we're going to keep it that way. And so the goal is to stop development within these nations, development together as a region, and development between the region and especially China. So these are the three main areas that USAID focuses on, which is an irony because, like I said, the left is claiming it's a humanitarian organization, and the Trump administration right now is trying to make it out as if it's this liberal. It's spreading liberal values around the globe. But what it is a tool of political capture that's been used for decades, regardless of who's in the White House, regardless of who controls Congress.
Why do you expect that the Trump administration is not going to go after the regime change, destabilization components of USAID and just focused on the relatively trivial stuff like, their role in whatever they can define as woke programs, things to do with, transgender issues, things like that, but not destabilizing countries?
Because President Trump himself, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, I mean, they're laying out their foreign policy right now, and they're talking about seizing the Panama Canal, seizing Greenland, regime change in Iran. North Korea is a rogue state. We need to compete with China. We need to contain China. How do you do that? What are the tools the United States has to do that? Are they going to compete with China by building infrastructure? No. USAID and organizations like it that go out and cause chaos, that knock down everything China and other nations are trying to build up. That is the only tool set that they actually have. And they are telling the American people that this is going to be their foreign policy. So, of course, they're not going to get rid of the most effective tools they have to do this. They're just going to streamline them and sharpen them.
But the counter argument would be in a place like Ukraine, where we've already seen complaints that all these media outlets that were supported by the U.S. have now been forced to curtail their operations or shut down. There was some figure like 90% of what's described as independent media in Ukraine is funded by the U.S. government via USAID. I'm not sure if that figure is accurate, but certainly there is a large percentage of these outlets in Ukraine that have been funded by the U.S., and they are complaining about how they're losing money. So the argument there would be this is a form of U.S. power. This is you being used to advance U.S. interests in the proxy war there. So here's Trump putting a freeze on their funding. That's an example of Trump taking on the so-called deep state.
Well, we have to wait and see if that's what actually happens. I don't think people understand these news platforms, these fake NGOs. They're not getting funded daily by USAID. They get money per month, sometimes per quarter, sometimes annual grants, and so it's not as if there's like money like instantly coming into their hands all day, every day, and now it's just been shut off like the water or the electricity. This is something that they'll have to wait a month, a quarter, or even a year to actually feel the effect of. And Secretary Rubio himself has said that they're going to review this. A lot of the programs that were frozen are already being funded again. There will be waivers, partial waivers. So if people actually listen to what the Trump administration itself is saying, they're not saying that this is permanent. They're reviewing it. There's undoubtedly going to be programs that are cut because it is bloated. And there is a huge amount of corruption. We saw that, say, in Afghanistan. In hindsight, we could see how much corruption there was there. If they could cut that and continue doing these type of activities, they will. And I'm almost certain that's what we will see. And if they do completely eliminate USAID, they will just replace it with something else. Because USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, all of these organizations have been created and reformed and rebranded over many, many years as people become aware of them, as targeted governments learn how to defend themselves against it. The U.S. itself adapts to this and changes their tactics, changes their tool sets.
Yeah, like one tell here is that people like Elon Musk keep talking about they're going after the radical left USAID, the radical left NED, when in fact the NED and USAID have long been used to go after what these same people call radical left states like Venezuela and Cuba. Like that's been their raison d'etre for so long. But yet now the same people supposedly dismantling USAID and the NED are calling them radical left, which doesn't really make sense because these groups are used to undermine governments that don't obey orders and therefore are called radical left.
Absolutely. And Elon Musk himself was using X to promote US backed regime change in Venezuela. I don't remember exactly when that was, but it was relatively recently. And how does he think this was being achieved? What tools, what vectors was the US using to implement attempted regime change in Venezuela? Of course, it's USAID, National Endowment for Democracy. All of these organizations that they're calling radical left were the ones they were using to, as you say, eliminate radical left government. So it is absurd. For people that are actually listening objectively, they will see that none of this actually adds up.